Hello, FM Power. My name is Cindy Baez, and today Kristen Sonneborn and I will be having a conversation to get a bit of an insight on what it's like to be a female bassoonist and rock star in her field. Thank you so much, Kristen, for joining us. So we're going to start by asking you a little bit about your career and what is your musical background. Like, how were you introduced to the bassoon? Who did you study with? And what schools did you go to?
Okay, well, I grew up in Northfield, Minnesota, and I was listening to the radio at a very young age and sort of trying to plunk the melody out on my mom's piano. And she recognized that I might have a little talent for music and started me on piano lessons around age 5.
Oh, okay.
But I have 2 older sisters that play bassoon, which is kind of a funny genetic defect in my family. And when I was old enough to take an instrument in 5th grade, I didn't want to be like them. I thought I'm going to be unique, and I picked the flute. In fact, just today on my Facebook feed, I had one of those memories come up.
Oh.
Picture of myself playing the flute in the back with my 2 sisters.
That's amazing.
Worth showing, even though it's kind of a bad printout. But so I played flute for about a year, and then my band director, who was another female bassoonist, said, "Don't you want to be different? We have 40 flute players at our school. Why don't you play oboe or bassoon?" And I knew the bassoon sounded good. My sisters were pretty good at the time, so I came with the bassoon. I thought my deal over. They were probably calculating in their head, how much is this going to cost now? Three people with a bassoon. So I guess at the time I wasn't even thinking about playing it professionally or majoring in music. It was just something I did for fun. And then I got good enough that my band director said, "Okay, you're a little over my ability. I'm sending you to a professional." At the time, Ben Kamens was playing in the Minnesota Orchestra. So I took about a year of lessons with him, and then he moved to Houston, and I took some lessons from the contrabassoon player there. But I ended up at St. Olaf in my hometown for college. I was an undeclared biology major when I went in and a performance major when I came out. So my teacher there was Charles Ullery in the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra. And I had followed his career since I was a kid. I listened to a lot of their live performances on the radio, and my parents would take me to concerts and stuff. So
sure you all knew about bassoons because of your sisters.
Correct. And we all loved music in my family, but they actually mentioned to me, going to college, you don't have to go into music just because they were in music and they were band directors right out of school. So I kind of knew from the start I didn't want to go the education route, but once I got on the music performance train at St. Olaf, I couldn't get off. Chuck was just a fabulous teacher and mentor, and it was through him that I ended up at USC studying with Norman Hertzberg at that time. He was a big influence on Chuck and then myself, so that was a life changer for me.
Would you say that they were your biggest musical experiences that you still continue to admire?
Oh, for sure. I think about both of them on a daily basis. Even if I'm just sitting in the orchestra counting rests, something will come to my head. So I don't think you ever lose that connection with your teachers. Yeah.
For sure. So funny that you mentioned that you started on flute because I was a clarinet player
Oh, really?
and I switched to bassoon. Similar idea. My band director at my high school was like, "Why are you playing clarinet?" Like, and she also gave me the option of oboe or bassoon, and I stuck with the bassoon. And now I'm a band director, so it's funny that how like those paths usually that usually tends to be the case, like where you usually switch over from something else to play bassoon. But interesting. Cool. What would you say is your
Well,
fondest memory? Yeah, I'm listening. Sorry.
no,
What
I
did
was going to say you kind of need a backup instrument for high school marching band and things like that. So it's good you had that.
well, in New York City, we actually don't have marching band, so I've never even seen a marching band live. So, but yes, what would you say is your fondest memory playing bassoon or something that you feel like you're very proud of?
Well, I don't have anything specific, but I would say that a lot of the performances where I'm with my favorite people, either playing chamber music or at my job, certainly some performances at St. Olaf or USC stood out where you get that emotional sort of lift from everybody participating at a really high level of energy. And I do recall the first time I played Rite of Spring and the first time I played Check 4 and big pieces like that where you've been working your whole, school life to try and get in an orchestra, and then finally that moment arrives. So those are pretty indelible. The one that sort of gave me goosebumps was working with Leonard Bernstein at Tanglewood when I was a fellow there, and we did Copeland 3 with him. And yeah, it was shortly before he passed away, and I felt lucky to have been able to work with him. So
Yeah, I can only imagine. That's amazing. So
yeah, he was
funny question.
okay. Okay.
Does your bassoon have a name? And like the reason why I asked that is because so being a band director, I taught middle school for 5 years. This is my year now teaching elementary. It's my first year moving over, and I have found that by making all of my kids name their instruments and become like a parent, and I don't have any issues with instrument repair because they take care of their instruments so much like a child. And so
What?
yeah, and so that has even, it has applied even to me because, I come from a musical family, so we have a lot of instruments also. And the kids always ask me, so what are your instrument names? And so I've gone to naming all of my instruments. So I wondered if you have named your instrument as well.
I had a bassoon that had a name when I was in college, but I have since sold that, and the one I'm playing on now I haven't named. But I was thinking about that as you were talking, and I think it's definitely a male, and I don't know why that is. It doesn't mean anything, but
Yeah.
and I also would say it's sort of an extension of myself. I feel like we have a friendly relationship and not adversarial in any way. I kind of want to take care of it, like you were saying. So I think that's a great thing. I should suggest it to my son. He's a percussionist. That's why I have the drum set in the back. But then he'll take better care of his stuff.
Yeah. I don't know what it is about like this year I went a little bit extra teaching elementary, so I actually gave them like little birth certificates, and I was like, now you're officially a parent. Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit more about your practice routine? How often do you practice? How long do you practice? What are some key things that you think that should be included in every practice session?
My practice depends on what I am doing at work. So if I have a day where I have 5 or 6 hours of rehearsal, I'm not likely to, go home and play another 2 hours or whatever. Um, if it's a day where I'm teaching, I'm playing off and on, but I'll still put in a practice session on my own because um, it would be less of a continuous hour or whatever. Um, I'd say my routine is pretty much an hour a day. I might take one day off a week. When I have time off, like now with the quarantine, I'll practice a bit. It's kind of therapeutic actually because I'm not preparing for anything immediately, and I can play whatever I want to. So my routine would be a warm up. Hertzberg had a very specific scale exercise, and I still do that to this day. It's basically the major and minor scales, but you never start on the actual note of the scale. You're always approaching it from underneath at the lowest part of the bassoon and then going as high as you can possibly go. And then there's different articulation patterns, kind of like the Uberdu book, if you've ever
Yes. Yes.
played that book, but it's similar to that. So I'll start out with something like thirds or fourths with a tuner for intonation, just getting it's sort of a Zen like meditation for me with the tuner needle, trying to get it centered. Um, and then either a long tone or whatever I'm feeling like that day, followed by an etude. I love etudes. I have tons of books, and they are written from all different levels. So if you're not athletic one day, you can pull out an easy one, or if really want to challenge, you can pull out these French etudes that go up to high E's and F's, and why not? So I love doing those. And then the second half of my practice, if I have a couple hours to myself and I'm working, then I'll spend the rest on tweaking my reads and working on the repertoire for work. So
Yeah. So I'm sure you've had rough days because everyone goes through that. Where would you say that you find that inner drive and motivation to help you push forward on those days?
well, I've always been sort of a driven person, but I know from having students myself that they get worn out. They're working on so many different things, and they've got other classes that they have papers to do and things like that. So my whole thing is, how efficient can you be? And depending on the amount of time you have, what can you do to accomplish the most in a short amount of time? So the main thing is just unzip these and taking it out. That is the first step, because it's easy to just walk by it on the floor and say, oh, I'll get to it later. So what I'll do is I'll take it out, I'll soak a reed, because you don't want to leave that soaking too long, which makes me like, okay, I gotta hurry up and practice. So that would be my first bit of advice: just take it out, put it together, soak that reed, and then start with something start with something easy. If you're feeling frustrated, definitely go to your strengths, play to your strengths. And after that, once you've gotten going, it gets easier for sure.
Right. Yeah. Awesome. So I'm gonna share real quick. I want to ask you, what is your most recent bassoon nightmare or dream? And so a couple of weeks ago, when we were not in quarantine, I was talking in a rehearsal while packing up. Big mistake, and I unzipped my bassoon instead of zipping the case. So when I put it on my back, I'm so glad that it wasn't high. I was like very low because my instrument fell out. And so of course you have that moment of freaking out slash crying. But what would you say is your biggest or most recent bassoon nightmare or dream? Like, you can make it positive.
I don't really dream about I don't really dream about my bassoon necessarily. On a regular basis, though, I'm always checking my reeds before I leave the house. Sometimes I've pulled off the road to just unzip the case and make sure I didn't forget them at home, or my seat strap, or showing up to a kiddie show and not having a neck strap, or stuff like that. It's usually technically related, but I did have sort of a nightmare happen to me when I was at USC. We were all supposed to play an opera every year with the opera program there, and my opera was Così fan tutte, and I was sitting near the edge of the pit, and I was elevated. The risers went up and up towards the back, and we started the overture, and I heard this high-pitched sort of sound coming, and everybody was turning around. They were listening for their watch and trying to figure out, and the conductor was worried. And it turns out my bag had fallen down next to that wall, and it bumped on my tuner. So I played the overture, and then I was responsible for that first aria, but the second bassoon player didn't have anything. So he crawled under and found out how to rip the battery out, because he was turning the metronome on and then the tuner on in the dark. He couldn't tell, and finally he crawled out covered in dust with my tuner, and I was so embarrassed. But that was one nightmare
Yeah.
that happened to me performing.
Yeah, I'm sure there's many things that like freak us out. Like now that you mentioned the tuner, I actually remember because I have the tuner that is also a metronome, like the old kind. And I was on the train one time and my metronome started. So I'm pretty sure like people were freaking out, but I didn't realize that it was mine. And so I'm sure they probably thought I had something dangerous because it was just clicking. So interesting things. How do you balance music with other obligations in your life? Like, do you have any obviously you have family, you said my son, but like pets, teaching, I'm assuming.
Yeah, so when I have one son, he's 14 now, but when he was little, that was tricky. I have a very reliable sitter who's now more of an Uber driver when I'm at work. My husband plays in the orchestra with me, so we have a similar schedule. But early on, he would take our son, and then I practiced, and vice versa. We'd trade off. Some people aren't so lucky to have a spouse home when they're home, so occasionally I would put him in one of his little play pens or whatever, and he would keep himself occupied for a little bit. But time was scarce for sure. And the biggest problem I find, and maybe other moms have found, is playing tired. I would have to play concerts until 10 or 10:30 at night, and I would want to pass out. I was focusing as hard as I could, but you really rely on coffee and things like that to help you along, because that lack of sleep is a killer. But now he's in middle school, and basically as soon as he went to school, you end up with a large chunk of time during the day. So that made your life a little more normal. Now the challenge, well, he'll be going to high school next year. The challenge is they start at 7 in the morning, which means it's an early start to the day. And if you come home from a concert at 11 o'clock at night, that will feel pretty brutal. So I'll be back to going to work tired again.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Have you encountered sexism in your line of work? And if you have, how did you handle it? How did you deal with that?
Well, unfortunately, I have encountered it. There have been some subtle things like mansplaining. That's a term you hear, where you'll be in a conversation and maybe you have an opinion, and I'll be told, this is the way it should be. It doesn't happen that often to me anymore, but when I was a grad student at SC, there were various contractors known for their um, knack of asking you out, and if you went out with that person, then you might get more freelance work and that sort of thing. I was never into that, so maybe I didn't get a lot of work. I don't know, but that kind of sexism, I think, still exists. Although now that I have a regular job, I'm not out in the freelance world very much. And then the worst thing I can think of is more overt, where I had won an audition for a small regional orchestra, and I was just out of grad school, and I was very excited. And it was behind a screen. I came out from behind the screen. I was going to meet the music director and the personnel manager, and the personnel manager said, "Oh, we thought you were a man."
Mm,
And I didn't know how to take that. I was like, "Thank you."
yeah.
I don't know if they thought I played well and confidently, and that would indicate that I was playing, assertively, and they guessed that it was a man, or if they were hoping it was a man. I don't know, but it really bothered me at the time. I did take the job, but that was the only time I've ever been sort of surprised by a comment like that.
Right. Yeah. And I feel like, at least in the times that we're living now, I do feel that people are more aware of that, but I can totally see that still occurring in the line of work, especially like in the cities. Like I live in New York City, and freelancing and stuff like that, you do still hear a lot of those comments. So it's interesting to hear that it was some that continues to be something that, like, I just don't understand it. Like that it still continues to happen even in the times that we are now.
Are you experiencing it at all where you live, or just
Um, yeah, most of it like that. Like you said, like, oh, I didn't realize you were a woman, or, like you said, like people who hire you specifically because they know that you are a woman for certain gigs, um,
Mhm.
rather than hiring you because of how you play. So it's
Yeah.
more of an appearance thing rather than um, actual musical skills, and so that can be a little bit frustrating, as well as a little bit, I say, a little bit demeaning as a female performer. So I definitely understand where you're coming from that. With that being said, is there any moment that you've ever felt empowered as a woman and to work with others?
Well, I guess that same experience, winning that one audition in a weird, twisted way, was empowering, because when I came out and surprised them, it was like, yeah, this is my job, so get over yourself. That I turned into a positive, from a negative. In general, I feel good because, for example, in my orchestra in Naples, except for two people, the wind section is entirely women.
That's great.
And the guys are great, don't get me wrong. But all the principals, except for the clarinet, are women. Um, and I see so many great performances by women. I think of Sophie Dervaux, uh, phenomenal player, and a lot of young players auditioning, and I think to myself, man, they're miles ahead of me, where I was at their age. So that empowers me too. I feel good that the next generation is kicking some butt and representing. So
Yeah. Especially now with the quarantine, more people are practicing. There's
it's either that or binging on TV. So I hope people are using some time to be productive.
Yeah. So speaking on that realm, how are you spending your quarantine time? Have you picked up any new hobbies? Have you come back to any hobbies?
Well, at first I thought I would be going back to work by now. We have been dark since, I think, March 12th.
Wow.
Uh, in fact, we showed up at work with our clothes, dressed for a concert with Augustin Hadelich, one of my favorite violinists, and someone was in the parking lot and said, "Oh, by the way, the concert is canceled." So it was that abrupt. And this is my 25th season, and so I got a call 2 days ago, no more season. So it was a very odd twist to the whole year. So it started out, I was about to say, it started out like, oh, this is really great. I have this time off. I'm going to do cooking. I'm going to get organized. And now it's like, oh, I don't have to rush around and do any of this stuff. I can, take my time because I'm pretty much off work now until September. Um, but I have been doing a lot of gardening, a lot of organization. Ordinarily, I make a lot of reads in August, but I've pushed that up till now because why not? I have the time. I'm still teaching from my home. I have some college students that are finishing out the semester, and I have several younger students here in town. So we're doing the video lessons. But other than that, I'm having a lot of family time. No major new hobbies, but kind of keeping up with my son and sticking around the house. So, how
Yeah.
about you? What up to?
I've also just been home, and we have to record our video lessons every single day and send them over. So throughout the day, I just spend basically answering parents and questions that the kids may have. So that pretty much takes up most of the day and throughout the morning. And then I've been reading more, so that's good. I always loved reading, but with how life is, sometimes you have to put it down, and there's just not enough time to read as much. So I've been reading, I've been read making more, which is something that I also used to kind of put aside. um, yeah, but just doing that. So, what would you say are three top essential qualities that make a good musician?
Well, that's a good question. Someone that has a job already can tell you that being a good colleague is really essential, but not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily make a good musician. I mean, there's plenty of musicians I know that have, problems interacting with other people. Um, but musically, I would say playing in tune. Number one, being able to find yourself in the chord if you're in an ensemble, and who is the one that needs to adjust, and kind of taking care of it yourself before the music director gives you the stink eye and waste rehearsal time working on something like that. So having a good ear and really developing your own sense of intonation is super important, I think. Rhythm, yeah, I can't say enough about. um, I really struggle getting my students to use a metronome sometimes, but it really does divide the pros from the amateurs, because you have really good internal rhythm, subdivision, things like that. Help the job a lot when you're working in a group. And then the last thing I would say personally is when you've played, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony 100 times and you're coming up on the 101st performance of it, you have to dig deep and find that freshness that maybe you've lost, or maybe you're working for a music director that's tyrannical and you feel a little let down, like, I can't believe I have to play this beautiful piece with such a jerk. It happens, not a lot anymore, but it can happen. And so it's finding that internal motivation and beauty in everything. It really helps to express yourself, even if you're just holding whole notes.
Mhm. Yeah, I also I find that really funny that you mentioned that, because I also believe in the idea that music can be anything and can be everything, but you have to put the effort and seek out the beauty in it. So I love that you mentioned that, you know, because it does. There's certain pieces and repertoire that do come up a lot within a season or within a couple of, once you've been playing for a bunch of years, there's a couple of quote unquote favorites that show up a lot in the repertoire, and so you have to try to present that in a new way to a new audience every time. So I love that you mentioned that. And I would say, what is one last thing that you hope that others will gain from today, from our conversation today?
Well, I think the right now during this time period, I might answer this question differently some other time, but I've been thinking a lot about how the healthcare professionals are in harm's way, and music seems kind of insignificant by comparison to what they're doing. But when this is all over, and hopefully it will be soon, and we can resume somewhat normal life, I feel like music will be extremely important, not only in kind of healing the souls of those people who have maybe dealt with the illness or lost people, but also the workers, and bringing joy and maybe happiness in some small way, and just healing a weary world, because we're all kind of going through it at one time. So I'm hoping that in, at least in the orchestra field, you know, that orchestras will come back stronger than ever, and that people will realize that it's sustaining us as a culture and as humanity. And hats off to you to teaching younger kids to appreciate, you know, they're going to be our next audience. So we need more teachers like you, and that inspires me too.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing this time and having this conversation with me, even though we're like on opposite ends of the country.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed talking to you and learning more about your career. So I
Wise.
appreciate you taking this time to be with me and with us in this quarantining that we are all doing.
Yeah, excited about this whole project. I can't wait to listen to some other people and find out what they're doing too.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you. And I hope you stay safe and hope to talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.